the Gospels, all of the New Testament started out as oral tradition. People are telling the stories of Jesus. They're talking about the sayings of Jesus and the stories of Jesus and what he did. It's kind of like we tell stories about people that have a big influence in our life. And scholars hypothesize that before the first gospel was written, Mark, that it was highly likely that they began to write down a collection of sayings, mostly sayings, very short, pithy, memorable sayings. Now think back in your life to your grandmother or your mom or your dad or your grandfather. What are some short, pithy sayings that you remember them passing on to you? They don't, and they don't have to be biblical.
If you can't say something nice, don't say anything.
There you go. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything, or don't say anything at all. Right? What are some others?
No rest for the weary.
No rest for the weary. Okay.
My grandma always said to smile and wave when people were being mean.
Okay. Smile and wave. Right. My grandmother, one of the wisest things she ever said to me, I'll never forget. She said, "You can't keep a bird from flying around your head, but you can make it. You can keep it from making a nest in your hair." And what's interesting is what she meant was you can't help your thoughts. You can't control your thoughts. Thoughts are going to swirl around in your head, but you can avoid acting on them. Letting them take root in your life and then acting on them. So you might have thoughts that, of being angry with somebody. But if you let those make a nest in your hair, take root in your heart, and then act on them, that's when you do have control over that. See? So, and we could probably think throughout the, did you have one, Diane?
I can't think of there were plenty of them. Some of you don't want to repeat.
Yeah.
That's the one I'm thinking of right
Yeah.
now.
Exactly.
Or you get more flies with honey, not vinegar.
Yeah.
So there are all these. So there's sayings that you remember those sayings because they're short and they're pithy and they connect in some way with your life. They pass on wisdom. And Jesus had a lot of short, pithy sayings if you go into the Gospels. And a lot of scholars believe that the early Christians, that the first thing that they began to write down before the Gospels were written were these short, pithy sayings, or perhaps some of the stories that Jesus told, maybe some of the parables, right? And this is a hypothesis. We don't actually have any manuscripts of these collected sayings or stories. But there's a reason why scholars believe this exists that I'll explain in a minute. But what they call it, what scholars call this hypothetical source, is called Q. And the reason why they call it Q is because there's a German word that, the German word for source starts with a Q. Okay? And I can't remember exactly what it is, and I think it's quell or quella. Yeah. But it's the German word for source starts with Q, and so this hypothetical collection is referred to as source material that we draw on to build something out of it, right? Then we have the first gospel that is written, which is the Gospel of Mark, and Mark is a narrative. It's not a collection of sayings. It's actually a story about Jesus. And it has a beginning, right? And it has a middle, it has a climax, it has conflict, it has resolution, all the major elements of a story or a narrative. It has a beginning and it goes somewhere and there's finally the resolution at the end, right? And it's a narrative that tells the story of Jesus. And a lot of scholars believe that Mark had this collection of sayings and then used this collection of sayings to build a narrative, and to tell a story. And again, it's important to remember this is not modern biography. This is not modern biography because Mark's primary concern was not to get all the facts right in terms of Jesus did this, and then Jesus did that, and then Jesus did that. That wasn't the main point of this gospel. The point of the gospel was to tell the story of Jesus that would give you an idea of his, an accurate portrayal of his character, of his teaching, the kind of man that he was, and the kinds of things that he did, and built that around major events in his life, like his, like the calling of the disciples, and then the temptation in the desert, and then the beginning of his earthly ministry, and then his conflict with the religious leaders, and then his arrest, and then his trial, and his death, and then his resurrection and his ascension. So there are these major events in the life of Jesus, and Mark wants to get those big pieces right. But then once he gets kind of the skeleton of the story in place, drawing from this source material of sayings and stories and drawing from the oral tradition that had been handed on to him, he literally built his story, taking from the sources, taking from the parables, taking from the oral tradition, and built his story. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And this becomes, this narrative structure becomes the structure that later on Matthew and Luke are going to use to tell their story. Okay? So we have Matthew and Luke were written, I'm going to draw a box around this, were written after this hypothetical source in the Gospel of Mark. And most scholars believe that Matthew and Luke both had copies of Mark. Okay? And both also had copies of this source material. And then they went on to write their own story, pretty much sticking pretty closely to the narrative structure in Mark, but filling it out, right? Telling it in a new way. And there are some things in Matthew that are unique to Matthew. Right? So there are things that he remembered in the oral tradition, or things that have been told to him that he records, that is not just a regurgitation of Mark, not just a regurgitation of this source material, but some things that are unique to him. And the same with Luke. Right? Luke tells his own story following the basic narrative structure of Mark, drawing on the same source material. But there are some things in Luke that are unique to Luke. So, for example, the story of the prodigal son, it's only in Luke. The Good Samaritan, it's only in Luke. Then we note some similarities and differences. So in Matthew, we have the Sermon on the Mount. And in Luke, we have something very, very similar that scholars sometimes refer to as, or I don't know scholars, but some people refer to as Sermon on the Plain. In Luke, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," period. Right? And he's dealing with some poor people. Matthew's version is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." You see the slight change? And their purposes are very different. Matthew is written primarily for a Jewish audience. And the main idea is to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. And so oftentimes when Matthew's telling the story of Jesus, it's like he's saying that Jesus is the new Moses. Moses goes up on the mountain, gets the 10 Commandments, brings them down for the people. What does Jesus do? Jesus goes up on the mountain, gets the Beatitudes, and if you read, Matthew 5 through, a couple chapters, you kind of get the new law, so to speak, and then gives it to the people, you see. And so Matthew is written primarily for a Jewish audience. So when he draws on Mark and the source material, he's writing mostly to Jews to try to show the Jewish people that he's a fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. And so he's going to tell the story slightly different than what Luke is doing, which Luke is written primarily for a Gentile audience, right? He's not trying to prove that Jesus is a fulfillment of Jewish scripture. That's not his primary goal, because his audience aren't Jews. They don't know what the prophecies are. He's writing for a different audience. So again, using the same basic narrative structure and drawing on Mark and drawing from the source material, Luke is going to write a different account for a different audience and tell the story a slightly different way. Does that make sense? So that's how they're sharing oral traditions. They're sharing written sources to build their narrative. And none of these guys, in none of these Gospels, are they saying, okay, we got to get the facts straight, right? Did Jesus cleanse the temple on this day and then do this? Or did Jesus cleanse the temple on that day and then do that? Honestly, it didn't really matter to them, because their goal was not to tell a factually precise story. It was to tell the story in a way to show people that Jesus is God's Son, that He's come to save the world. And their goal is to get you to believe in Him and to say, I want to be a disciple, right? Modern historians aren't writing their books so that you'll say, I want to follow this person. I want to follow Abraham Lincoln. I want to be one of his disciples. That's not what they're saying. But the Gospels, that is what they're trying to do. They're telling the story in a way that's this mixture of pre-modern biography and preaching to try to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ so that you will come to believe that He is the Son of God and say, I want to be a part of that great rescue mission of the world. That's the whole point. See the difference? And then the Gospel of John, most scholars believe that John was written independently of most of this stuff. Now, they shared some of the same oral tradition. John was writing primarily for a Greek audience, we believe, because it tends to be very spiritual, philosophical, mystical, deep. I mean, Matthew starts out with this very earthy story of this pregnant teenager who has to go to Bethlehem and gives birth in a cave around a bunch of animals. It's very earthy. It's very, it's a very specific, you can almost feel the texture in the story. John starts out, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. The world was created by the Logos. Logos is a Greek term that refers to word, and it means the logic of reality. See how philosophical that is? Very, very different. Jesus is much more human in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the authors portray Him as much more human than in John. In John, Jesus, in times, He seems to know everything. He never lacks knowledge. He's always in control. It's almost like He's like this superhero in John, who always has the right answer and is always in control and in charge of things, right? So this, although they shared some common oral traditions, people don't believe that John sat down with a copy of Mark and a copy of Q and constructed their gospel, that there was some overlap in the oral tradition, but that they developed some of their own traditions about Jesus independently, and that's why that gospel is so different.